of all, the individual producer of a product A, doesn't recognize him or herself any longer when producing. And we will see in a second what that could mean. This is symmetrical also for B. So this process is somehow disrupted. What is then also disrupted is that A properly responds to the human needs of B, and vice versa. And they fail to recognize that they are actually part of the same human and communal nature. Let's have a little bit of a closer look of why under capitalism, or we may say the alienated mode of production, the ideal model of action doesn't work anymore. And here I refer to the different modes of alienation. 4 different modes that correspond also to these different types of, let's say, disturbances of this ideal model. The first kind of alienation under capitalism is the separation from the product of labor. So to quote Marx again here, in order, therefore, to find an analogy, we must have recourse to the enveloped regions of the religious world. In that world, the productions of the human brain appear as independent beings endowed with life and entering into relations both with one another and the human race. So it is in the world of commodities with the products of man's hand. This I call the fetishism, which attaches itself to the products of labor so soon as they are produced as commodities. End of quote. So what happens under capitalism is that, as you recall, workers were expropriated from the means of production. So they are employed through a labor contract. They produce products of labor, which are then basically taken away from them again because they are sold on markets. They just receive wages. So they produce a lot of wealth, but are separated from the eventual products. This is then the first mode of alienation. And on top of this mode comes, let's say, a certain misunderstanding that workers have of this first mode of alienation, which Marx refers to as fetishism, which he borrows from his critique of religion. So workers consider the commodities they produce, or the products they produce, actually as commodities that are not belonging to themselves anymore, but which in a way have a life of their own. And this misunderstanding is also something critical in Marx's critique of the capital and the process. And it results from this first mode of alienation. The second mode of alienation here is the separation of the producers, so the workers, from the productive activity. So Marx himself mentions then hyper-specialization, or also the physically destructive nature of work in factories as instances. So think about the conditions of the laboring classes in the 19th century, where very specialized sort of bodily movements alienated also workers from the very product, so process of work. So they were not enjoying anymore what they were doing, but they were basically, a little bit like Charlie Chaplin's Modern Times worker in the factory, a bit lost and not understanding anymore how the process of work leads to the final product. So in a way, they were losing this very first step in finding themselves in the final product already by not recognizing themselves in the process of work. A third mode of alienation then is that producers are separated from others in the process of work. That means that they treat others only again through in a way, in an instrumental way, through fulfilling their own needs. So the ideal that Marx has here is to say that in an ideal world, then a producer should recognize the human need in another producer. And this should be the main motivation to produce something to fulfill this need, because only through this fulfillment and also this mutual fulfillment is it that these producers identify themselves as being part of a common and communal human nature. And now think about the capitalist process, where I'm rather trying to find out how I can fulfill my own needs, and I need your needs instrumentally to sort of fulfill my own needs, right? So the worst case probably in marketing, I try to instrumentalize you, I try to produce new needs for you to buy my products so that I can finally fulfill my needs. So in a way, there is a swap of what is the proper means and the proper ends here. So I use, in a way, your needs as means to fulfill my ends, and I don't see your needs as the ends that drive my behavior anymore. The fourth type of alienation then is that due to these first three also types of alienations, producers are separated from realizing their human nature. That is, they are obstructed to, in a way, become flourishing human beings. They are, in a way, suboptimally realized. They are very far from an ideal of not only realizing themselves, but also recognizing themselves in the cooperation with others. This produces then a fourfold alienation that Marx sees as one of the main problems in the capitalist production system. Yeah? So let's move this model of idealist model of production that Marx twisted then and turned to the material model and put this more into the historical context. So what we've been discussing so far is this middle here, where we have the sort of bottom model of action, right? A and B are producing products, they're exchanging products, they are trying to realize their human nature in this process. And by doing this, they produce kind of capital. Yeah? Under capitalism, that is under these institutions of private property, division of labor, and so on, there's something of an emergent new historical subject that Marx on like page 169 of the German Kapital describes as the automated subject of capital. So think about this a little bit in our talk of global or international capital markets, right? That shift around money, this is like M here, into different capitalist enterprises. So they transform this money into capital and try to produce money plus a certain surplus out of this process. And this describes a little bit the main conditions of what is a subject in the idealist term. So a subject is something that can refer to itself, for instance, right? I can think about myself as myself, right? And so this automated subject capital, as you see in this little formalized equations that is taken from Marx Capital, also refers to itself. So the money going through this this capital transforms itself into another kind of money, but it refers to itself. Yeah. So Marx thinks a little bit about this as a zero-sum game. Yeah. So that parts of the subject nature of human beings that are lost in this alienated model of production here is lost, but is gained by capital that is, in a way, an automated subject. And this subject is realized in the actions of capitalists that fight workers in this famous class struggle. But capitalists themselves are, I mean, they are just what Marx would say character masks. So they just have the social role of being capitalists. They themselves are driven by the logic of capital, and they just realize this automated subject. So in this entire process of production, then there's a generation of surplus value that capital extracts from workers, surplus labor. Marx follows the liberal tradition in thinking that labor is the source of all value, but he divides value or labor into let's say the necessary kind of labor that workers need in order to fulfill their basic reproduction needs on the one hand, and surplus labor on the other hand, that is in a way the additional hours a worker has to work just by contract for the capitalist and beyond his or her human needs. And it is this surplus labor, if you want, these hours that workers work for free, the surplus labor then that Marx considers the source of capitalist wealth, and which enables this accumulation of more and more capital, which then sort of haunts the world in a way for the maximization of profits, and in a way refers to itself by gaining ever more money. And this is not just a very structuralist process, but is realized in a class struggle between capitalists and workers. So in pre-capitalist times, there was already a similar kind of class struggle going on between, let's say, serfs and slaves on the one hand, and the feudal rulers on the other hand, such that the history is a history of class struggles. Marx